Hi everyone, welcome to Papertown. I hope you're all doing well. Tonight we're going to talk about something that hides in plain sight. Something you've probably laughed at hundreds of times without ever stopping to think about what you were actually laughing at. We're going to talk about South Park, but not in the way you're used to hearing about it. Not the controversies, not the political takes, not the censorship battles. We're going to talk about the genuine, documented darkness that lives underneath every joke this show has ever told. The kind of darkness that doesn't announce itself. The kind that sits quietly behind a punchline and waits for you to notice. And here's the thing, most people never do notice, because the show is so good at what it does that the comedy becomes a kind of anesthetic. You laugh, and the laughter numbs you to what just happened. And what just happened, in many cases, is something that would be genuinely horrifying if it appeared in any other context. So tonight, settle in, get comfortable. If you're here to drift off, that's perfectly fine. Let your mind wander through this one. And if you're here because you want to think about it, even better. Because once you see what's underneath the surface of South Park, you can't really unsee it. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. There's a moment that happens to almost every South Park fan at some point. You're watching an episode you've seen before, maybe for the third or fourth time, and something shifts. A joke lands differently. A character does something that used to be funny, and this time, it isn't. Not because the joke changed, but because you did. You grew up a little. You learned something about the world that you didn't know before. And suddenly, that scene, that throwaway gag you used to laugh at without thinking, reveals itself as something else entirely. That's the experience we're going to explore tonight. That slow, creeping recognition that South Park isn't just a crude cartoon about foul-mouthed kids in a small Colorado town. It's one of the bleakest portraits of American life ever committed to screen. And it's been hiding behind construction paper cutouts and fart jokes for over 25 years. Let's start with the character most people think they understand. Eric Cartman. Because Cartman is where the show's darkness is most visible, and paradoxically, most invisible. He's so outrageous, so over the top, that it's easy to dismiss him as pure comedy. A caricature. An exaggeration so extreme, it circles back around to being funny. And for the first few seasons, that's more or less what he was. A bratty, selfish kid who said terrible things and got his comeuppance often enough to feel like the show was keeping him in check. But then, something happened. Slowly, across seasons, Cartman stopped being a brat and became something else. Something the show never explicitly names, but makes unmistakably clear through his actions. He became a genuine sociopath. Not in the casual way people throw that word around. Not just mean or selfish or lacking empathy in the way children sometimes are. Cartman displays a consistent, escalating pattern of behavior that, if you mapped it onto a real person, would be genuinely terrifying. He manipulates. He lies without effort or remorse. He exploits vulnerability in others with surgical precision. He feels no guilt, no shame, and no empathy. And the show documents this escalation with a kind of clinical detachment that makes it all the more unsettling. The moment most fans point to as the turning point is, Scott Tenorman must die. Season 5, Episode 4. It aired on July 11th, 2001, and South Park was never quite the same after it. The setup is almost childishly simple. A ninth grader named Scott Tenorman tricks Cartman into buying his pubic hair for $16.12. Cartman, humiliated, wants revenge. And what follows is an elaborate scheme that ends with Cartman arranging for Scott's parents to be killed, grinding their bodies into chili, and feeding that chili to Scott at a public event. While Scott's favorite band, Radiohead, watches and mocks him for crying. Now, if you've seen the episode, you probably remember it as darkly funny, maybe even brilliantly funny. The twist is so extreme, so unexpected, that the shock itself becomes the joke. And that's exactly how the show wants you to process it. Through laughter. Through the lens of comedy. Because if you strip away the cartoon format, the silly voices, the absurd setup, What you're left with is a 9-year-old child who committed premeditated murder, mutilated the bodies, and psychologically tortured the victim's son by making him eat his own parents, and then licked the tears off his face. Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park, have spoken about this episode in interviews. They acknowledged that during production, they debated whether it was a step too far, even for Cartman. Parker said the episode set a new bar for what the character could be portrayed doing. Stone put it more bluntly. He said that after that episode, nothing would ever be the same with that character again. And he was right. Because Scott to Norman Must Die didn't just cross a line, it erased the line. After that, Cartman's behavior could never be fully contained by comedy again. The audience knew what he was capable of. The question was no longer whether Cartman was funny. It was whether it was still appropriate to laugh. But here's what makes it even darker. In season 14, in the episode titled 201, we learn something that recontextualizes the entire Scott Tenorman incident. It's revealed that Scott Tenorman is actually Cartman's half-brother. They share the same father, which means that when Cartman arranged for Scott's parents to be killed, he was killing his own biological father. And he didn't know it at the time, but when he found out later, his primary reaction wasn't horror or guilt. It was annoyance that he was half ginger. Think about that for a moment. A child discovers he murdered his own father, and his emotional response is vanity. Not grief, not shock, vanity. That's not a comedy beat. That's a character study in psychopathy so precise it could appear in a clinical textbook. And the escalation doesn't stop there. In Casa Bonita, Season 7, Episode 11, Cartman convinces Butters that a meteor is about to destroy the Earth. He locks Butters in an underground shelter for days, telling him that everyone he knows and loves is dead. The entire town searches for Butters, while Cartman attends a birthday party at a restaurant. He did all of this, caused all of this suffering and panic, because he wanted to go to Casa Bonita and wasn't invited. In Crack Baby Athletic Association, Season 15, Episode 5, Cartman creates an organization that films crack-addicted babies fighting over drugs and broadcasts it for profit. The entire episode plays as a satire of the NCAA and college athletics, which is clever and pointed. But underneath the satire is the fact that Cartman is exploiting the most vulnerable human beings imaginable. Infants born addicted to narcotics for personal financial gain. And no one stops him. That last part is important. No one stops him. Because the town of South Park, as we'll explore throughout this video, is fundamentally broken. The adults don't just fail to protect the children. They actively create the conditions for harm and then look away when it happens. But we'll come back to that. For now, let's stay with the darkness that lives inside individual characters. Because Cartman isn't the only one carrying something terrible beneath the surface. Let's talk about Kenny McCormick. Because Kenny's story might be the most genuinely tragic thing in the entire show, and it's been played for laughs since the very first episode. You know the running joke. Kenny dies. His friends say, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny." They call him a bastard. And then next episode, Kenny's back, alive and well, with no explanation. For years, that was the extent of it. A recurring gag. A meta joke about cartoon logic and the disposability of fictional characters. Kids found it funny. Adults found it absurd. Nobody thought too hard about what it would actually mean. And then, in season 14, the show told us what it actually means. The 3-part Coon and Friends storyline, comprising Coon 2, Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon vs. Coon and Friends, aired between October and November of 2010. And in those episodes, we learned something that changes everything about Kenny as a character. We learn that Kenny's deaths are real. Every single one of them. He experiences the full pain of every death. He feels himself being crushed, burned, torn apart, impaled, dissolved, and every other gruesome fate the show has subjected him to over the years. And then he wakes up in his bed the next morning, alive again, with complete memory of what happened. But here's the part that makes it truly devastating. Nobody else remembers. His friends, his family, everyone who witnessed his death, they all forget. Every time. Kenny has died hundreds of times across the series, and each time, he's experienced the complete terror and agony of death, only to wake up in a world where no one knows it happened. No one mourns him. No one checks on him. No one says, "Hey, are you okay?" after that thing that happened yesterday. Because to everyone around him, nothing happened. The show reveals that this is connected to a cult his parents were involved with before he was born. The McCormicks attended meetings of a group that worshipped Cthulhu, and something that happened during those rituals, while Kenny's mother was pregnant with him, cursed Kenny with immortality. It's framed within the show's typically absurd mythology, complete with Lovecraftian references and superhero parodies. But strip away the genre trappings, and what you have is this: a child who cannot die, who suffers the full trauma of death repeatedly, and who exists in complete isolation because the one thing that defines his existence is invisible to everyone around him. That's not a comedy premise. That's one of the loneliest existences you could possibly imagine. Kenny lives in a world where his deepest, most defining experience, the thing that shapes every moment of his life, is something no one will ever understand, acknowledge, or remember. He can't talk about it. He can't process it with anyone. He can't get help. He just dies, and wakes up, and goes to school, and pretends everything is normal. And the show knows this. In the Mysterion episodes, Kenny is visibly frustrated and angry that no one remembers his deaths. He tries to tell people. He tries to prove it, and it doesn't work. The memory erasure is involuntary, some kind of supernatural mechanism that wipes the knowledge from everyone's minds. Kenny is trapped in a cycle of suffering that he can never escape and can never share. There's a moment in Coon vs. Coon and Friends where Kenny kills himself, deliberately, just to demonstrate his power. He shoots himself in the head in front of his friends, and the next day, they don't remember. It's played partly for dark comedy, partly for superhero drama. But imagine being a real child who experiences that. Imagine dying, violently, in front of the people you love most, and then seeing them the next morning, and knowing they have no memory of it, no awareness of your sacrifice, no understanding of your pain. You are, in the most fundamental sense possible, invisible. And it gets worse when you consider the rest of Kenny's life. He comes from the poorest family in town. His parents are alcoholics. His home is falling apart. He doesn't have reliable access to food. He's neglected in every material sense. And on top of all that material deprivation, he carries this impossible psychological burden alone. Most analyses of South Park treat Kenny as a gag character. The one who dies. The one with the muffled voice. The one who makes dirty jokes. And the show encourages this reading most of the time. But in the episodes where it chooses to be serious about Kenny, where it pulls back the curtain and shows you what's actually happening to him, the picture that emerges is one of profound, unrelenting suffering. A child who has been abandoned by every system that should protect him, biological, social, supernatural, and who copes with this abandonment by pretending it doesn't matter. Let's sit with that for a moment before we move on. Because the way we as viewers have treated Kenny mirrors the way the characters in the show treat him. We laugh at his deaths. We barely notice when he's gone. We don't think about what it costs him. And that might be the most disturbing thing of all. The show has trained us to be complicit in the same indifference that makes Kenny's existence so lonely. Now let's turn to the character who might be the show's most heartbreaking creation. Butterscotch. If Kenny's darkness is about isolation, Butters' darkness is about something almost worse. Butters is surrounded by people. He has parents. He has friends. Sort of. He's part of the community. He's visible. He's present. And every single person in his life either abuses him, exploits him, or stands by while someone else does. Butters is, by any reasonable measure, a victim of systematic abuse. Not the dramatic, single-incident kind that makes headlines. The slow, grinding, everyday kind that destroys a person from the inside out. The kind where the people doing it don't even think of it as abuse. Where it's so normalized, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that the victim starts to believe it's just how things are. Let's go through it. Because the scope of what Butters endures across the series is staggering when you lay it all out. His parents, Chris and Linda Stotch, they ground Butters for essentially anything, and not in the normal parental discipline way. They ground him for things that aren't his fault, things that are absurd, things that are clearly the result of other people's actions. He gets grounded because his father accidentally poured rice-a-roni in his own coffee. He gets grounded for making what his parents consider a silly face in a school photo when that's just his face. The grounding is constant, disproportionate, and often accompanied by screaming. But it goes much further than grounding. In Jared Has AIDS, Cartman impersonates Butters on the phone and says terrible things to his parents. And his parents' response is to physically beat Butters, not Cartman. Butters, the child who did nothing wrong, who wasn't even on the phone. They beat him for words that someone else said. In Butters' very own episode, Season 5, Episode 14, which aired on December 12th, 2001, we get perhaps the most disturbing look at the Stotch family. Butters discovers that his father has been secretly visiting gay bathhouses and adult bookstores. When his mother Linda finds out, her response isn't to confront her husband or seek therapy or file for divorce. Her response is to attempt a murder-suicide. She tries to kill Butters and herself by driving a car off a dock into a river. She tries to drown her own child rather than face the reality of her marriage. Butters survives, because of course he does. This is still technically a comedy. But think about what that means for his character. His own mother tried to kill him. Not in a moment of psychotic break removed from her personality. In a calculated decision that she made because dealing with the shame of her husband's secret was more important to her than her child's life. And then there's what happens outside the family. The show consistently positions Butters as the kid everyone takes advantage of. Cartman uses him as a pawn in nearly every scheme. In Casa Bonita, Cartman locks him in a fallout shelter for days. In the episode where Paris Hilton comes to town, Stupid Spoiled Whore Video Playset, Season 8, Episode 12, Paris Hilton literally tries to buy Butters from his parents as a pet. She offers $200 million. And his parents, the people whose primary job is to protect this child, seriously consider the offer. They only turn it down because they want $250 million instead. Meanwhile, Butters discovers that all of Paris Hilton's previous pets have killed themselves. The album of dead animals isn't subtle. It's the show telling you, directly, that Butters was being sold into a situation that leads to death, and his parents were haggling over the price. Then there's Cartman Sucks, Season 11, Episode 2. Cartman puts Butters in a compromising position. Butters' father walks in, and without any investigation or conversation with his son, Stephen Stotch decides Butters is bi-curious and sends him to a conversion therapy camp called Camp New Grace. The camp is portrayed as a nightmare. Children are told they're broken. They're shamed for who they are. The show reveals that kids at the camp have attempted and completed suicide. And Butters, who isn't even gay, who was put in this situation entirely by Cartman's cruelty, has to navigate this traumatic environment alone. The episode's climax comes when Butters finally speaks up. He tells the camp counselors that he wasn't confused until they started telling him he was. It's a moment of genuine clarity and courage from a character who rarely gets to assert himself. But the brilliance of the satire doesn't erase the horror of the situation. A child was sent to a facility where other children have died, by his own father, based on a misunderstanding, and no adult in the process thought to ask Butters what actually happened. There's a detail that gets mentioned almost in passing throughout the series. Butters has an uncle, Uncle Bud, who has apparently committed sexual acts against him. Butters mentions this casually, without fully understanding what happened to him. The show doesn't dwell on it. It doesn't make it an after-school special. It just lets this information exist in the background of Butters' life, the way real abuse often exists. Not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet, constant presence that shapes everything without ever being properly addressed. And then there's Professor Chaos. In Season 6, Episode 6, the boys hold a competition to replace Butters as their friend, essentially auditioning candidates while telling Butters to his face that he's not good enough to hang out with them anymore. The rejection is total and public. And Butters, feeling abandoned by the only social group he has, creates Professor Chaos, a villainous alter ego who tries to wreak havoc on the world. It's played for comedy, obviously. Professor Chaos is hilariously ineffective. His schemes are tiny and pointless, but the psychology underneath is real and documented. Children who experience chronic rejection and abuse sometimes develop alternate personas as a way of reclaiming agency. If the world is going to hurt you, no matter what you do, at least as a villain, you're the one in control. Professor Chaos isn't funny when you understand it as a trauma response. It's heartbreaking. There's another dimension to Butters' suffering that's easy to overlook because it's so pervasive. He's constantly lied to. Everyone lies to Butters. Cartman lies to him to manipulate him. His parents lie to him to control him. The other children lie to him because it's convenient. And Butters believes them, every time, because his fundamental orientation toward the world is one of trust. This is something the show handles with surprising nuance. Butters isn't naive in the way that fictional characters are often naive, as a setup for comedy where the naive person looks foolish. Butters is trusting in the way that children who have been failed by their primary caregivers are sometimes trusting. It's counterintuitive, but research on attachment suggests that children who experience inconsistent care can develop patterns of anxious attachment that actually increase their tendency to seek approval and believe what authority figures tell them. They learn that safety comes from compliance, not from critical evaluation. And so they comply. They believe. They trust. Not because they're stupid, but because their survival has depended on it. Butters trusts Cartman because Cartman is part of his social world, and Butters' experience has taught him that the cost of challenging people is higher than the cost of going along with them. He trusts his parents because they're his parents, and questioning your parents requires a kind of psychological independence that Butters has never been allowed to develop. He trusts the system because the system is all he has, and the system betrays him, every time, without exception. The trust that keeps Butters alive, that maintains his ability to function in a hostile world, is also the mechanism through which he's repeatedly harmed. The thing that protects him is the thing that destroys him. That's not ironic. That's tragic. And through all of this, through the parental abuse, the peer exploitation, the sexual assault, the conversion therapy, the attempted murder by his own mother, Butters remains fundamentally good. He's kind. He's trusting. He's optimistic. He forgives. He keeps showing up. And the show uses this goodness not as a triumph, but as a tragedy. Because Butters' goodness is what makes him vulnerable. It's what allows people to keep hurting him. His inability to see the worst in people is the very thing that guarantees he'll continue to be used by them. There's something profoundly uncomfortable about watching a character be this consistently victimized and still laughing. Because the show does make it funny. It wraps every instance of Butters' suffering in enough absurdity and comedic timing that you can, if you choose to, process it entirely through laughter. But the facts remain. If you wrote down everything that happens to Butters across the series without any of the jokes, without the cartoon format, without the silly voices, you'd have a Child Protective Services case file that would make a social worker weep. Now, I want to pull back from individual characters and talk about something larger, the town itself. Because one of the most disturbing aspects of South Park isn't what happens to any single character. It's the system that allows all of it to happen. The town of South Park, Colorado, functions as a kind of microcosm for institutional failure. And the show documents that failure with a consistency that suggests it's not accidental. It's the point. Think about the adults in this show. Really think about them. The parents are, almost without exception, either neglectful, abusive, or so consumed by their own issues that their children are essentially raising themselves. Randy Marsh is an alcoholic whose obsessions regularly endanger his family. The Broflovskis are overbearing in ways that create their own kind of damage. The Stotches are actively abusive. The McCormicks are absent. The Tweaks exploit their son's anxiety for profit. The Cartman household is a single-parent home where the parent has essentially abdicated all authority, and the institutions are no better. The school is overseen by adults who range from incompetent to malicious. Mr. Garrison, across various iterations of the character, has subjected students to inappropriate content, psychological manipulation, and outright neglect. PC Principal, introduced later, represents a different kind of failure. Performative concern that addresses surface-level issues while ignoring the structural ones. The police are consistently portrayed as either incompetent or easily manipulated. In The Wacky Molestation Adventure, Season 4, Episode 16, the children of South Park discover that if they tell the police their parents molest them, the police will immediately arrest the parents without investigation. The entire adult population gets carted off, and the town descends into a Lord of the Flies scenario where children form warring factions and people die. The police response to the children's claims is instantaneous and total. Their response to the actual suffering of children throughout the rest of the series is effectively non-existent. That contrast is deliberate. The show is saying something about how institutions respond to the appearance of harm versus the reality of it. When there's a headline-grabbing accusation, the system overreacts. When there's quiet, ongoing, structural abuse, the system does nothing. Because structural abuse doesn't generate headlines. It doesn't create clear villains. It's just the water everyone swims in. And the townspeople themselves are complicit in a way that mirrors real communities. They know things are wrong. They see the drinking, the neglect, the exploitation. They witness Cartman's behavior, Butter's suffering, Kenny's poverty, and they do nothing. Not because they're evil, because confronting it would mean confronting themselves. It would mean admitting that their community, their way of life, their own parenting is part of the problem, and that's too uncomfortable. So they look away. They change the subject. They treat each new horror as an isolated incident rather than a pattern. This is one of the most psychologically realistic things about South Park. The town's enabling isn't dramatic. It's banal. It's the way a real community might handle uncomfortable truths, not through conspiracy or malice, but through the simple human desire to not think about things that are painful to think about. And the children learn from this. They learn that adults can't be relied on. They learn that institutions won't protect them. They learn that the appropriate response to trauma is to shrug it off, make a joke, and move on. This is the unspoken education that South Park gives its child characters, and it's far more formative than anything they learn in school. Now let's talk about something that ties many of these threads together. Randy Marsh and the pattern of addiction that runs through the show like an underground river. Randy is, in many ways, the adult embodiment of South Park's central thesis. He's a character who started as a background figure, Stan's unremarkable geologist father, and over the course of the series evolved into arguably the show's true protagonist. And that evolution tracks almost exactly with his descent into increasingly destructive patterns of behavior. Randy's alcoholism is the most obvious element. It's been a consistent character trait since the early seasons, and the show treats it with a fascinating duality. On one hand, Randy's drunken antics are some of the funniest moments in the series. His fight at the Little League game, his attempts to give himself cancer so he can get a medical marijuana card, his absolute inability to drink responsibly at any social function. These scenes are hilarious. They're some of the most rewatchable moments in the show. On the other hand, if you track Randy's drinking across the series, it follows a textbook pattern of addiction. He drinks to cope with stress. He drinks to celebrate. He drinks when he's bored. He minimizes the consequences. He promises to change and doesn't. He blames external factors. He gets progressively worse over time. In Bloody Mary, Season 9, Episode 14, Randy gets a DUI and is sent to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. The episode satirizes the AA model by having Randy interpret his diagnosis as meaning alcoholism is a disease beyond his control, which he then uses as an excuse to keep drinking. Stan eventually confronts him and argues that calling it a disease just gives him permission to avoid taking responsibility. It's a complex, nuanced take that doesn't fully side with either perspective. But what's notable is that the episode ends without resolution. Randy doesn't get better. He doesn't have a breakthrough. He just continues. And that's the pattern for the rest of the series. Randy moves from one obsession to the next. Cooking, being in a band, becoming a celebrity chef, farming marijuana at Tegrity Farms. Each one functioning as a new expression of the same underlying compulsion. He's a man who cannot sit with himself, who cannot tolerate ordinary life, who needs constant stimulation, constant drama, constant novelty to avoid confronting whatever void exists at the center of his experience. The Tegrity Farms arc, which began in Season 22 and continued for several seasons, is particularly revealing. Randy moves his family to a marijuana farm, convinced that this geographic change will fix his life. It's what addiction researchers sometimes call a geographic cure, the belief that the problem is where you are rather than who you are. And predictably, it doesn't work. Randy brings all his dysfunction with him. He becomes obsessed with the weed business, the same way he's been obsessed with everything else. The location changes. The pattern doesn't. And through all of this, Stan watches. Stan, who had his own depression arc in Season 15's You're Getting Old and Asperger's. Stan, who turned 10 years old and suddenly found that nothing in the world brought him joy anymore. Everything looked and sounded like, well, the show used a specific metaphor. Everything was terrible. Music, movies, food, his friends' conversations, all of it registered as awful. A doctor told him he'd become a cynical asshole. But what the show was actually depicting was clinical depression. The sudden onset of anhedonia. The inability to experience pleasure, combined with social withdrawal and a pervasive sense of meaninglessness. Those episodes aired as a two-parter split across the mid-season break of 2011. You're Getting Old ended on June 8th with Stan's parents separating, Stan losing his friends, and the entire status quo of the show appearing to collapse. When Asperger's aired on October 5th, it resolved the arc, but not in a hopeful way. Stan gets better, sort of, but the episode ends with him drinking to cope, just like his dad. Trey Parker described the writer's room after You're Getting Old as being genuinely uncertain about what to do next. The episode was so bleak, so final feeling, that it looked from the outside like a statement about the show itself being over. Parker later said it wasn't intended that way, but the fact that it read that way tells you something about how effectively the episode conveyed despair. And it's worth noting that Sharon, Stan's mother, sees all of this. She's not blind. She threatens to leave Randy. She expresses frustration, disappointment, anger. But she stays. And her staying is another form of enabling. Not because staying in a marriage is inherently wrong, but because the show makes clear that Sharon stays not out of love or commitment, but out of exhaustion. Out of the feeling that this is just how things are. That men like Randy don't change. And the best you can do is manage the damage. In You're Getting Old, Sharon actually does leave. She separates from Randy, moves Stan to a new house, and for one episode, it looks like she's broken the cycle. But by the next episode, Asperger's, everything has reset. She's back with Randy. Stan's back with his friends. The status quo is restored, not because anything was resolved, but because maintaining the dysfunction is easier than sustaining change. That reset is one of the most honest things the show has ever done, because in real life, that's exactly what happens. People in dysfunctional systems attempt to leave, and the gravitational pull of familiarity drags them back. Change requires sustained effort, sustained discomfort, and a support system that rewards the new pattern over the old one. Sharon has none of those things. She has a town full of people whose own dysfunctions mirror hers. A community where heavy drinking is normal, where marital chaos is common, where the response to pain is distraction rather than healing. Of course she goes back. Where else would she go? The parallel between Stan and Randy is the show's quiet tragedy. A father's unaddressed addiction and emotional avoidance create conditions that produce the same patterns in his son. Stan doesn't choose to become like Randy. He's shaped by an environment where dysfunction is normal, where numbing yourself is the default coping strategy, and where no one models a healthier alternative. By the time Stan reaches for alcohol at 10 years old, the groundwork has been laid for a lifetime. This is generational trauma rendered in construction paper animation. It's the oldest story in psychology. The parent who was never given healthy tools passes down their brokenness to the child, not through malice, but through modeling. Stan didn't sit down one day and decide to cope with pain through alcohol. He absorbed it. He watched his father reach for a drink every time something was difficult and learned, without anyone teaching him, that this is what you do when the world hurts too much. Randy, in turn, probably learned it from his father. The show doesn't explore Randy's childhood in detail, but it doesn't need to. The pattern is self-evident. This dysfunction has roots that go back generations, and the community reinforces it. South Park is a town where heavy drinking is not just tolerated, but celebrated. Randy's drunken brawls at sporting events are treated as spectacles, not interventions. His DUI is played for laughs. His increasingly erratic behavior is met with eye rolls rather than concern. Nobody stages an intervention. Nobody pulls Stan aside and says, "Hey, your dad has a problem, and it's not your fault, and here's how to get help." Because in South Park, everyone is too busy managing their own dysfunction to address anyone else's. This is what systems-level failure looks like. It's not one bad parent. It's an entire ecosystem that produces and reproduces harm. The schools don't teach coping skills. The medical system doesn't catch the warning signs. The social fabric, such as it is, rewards conformity over health. And the children, who are the most vulnerable members of this ecosystem, are left to navigate it with nothing but each other. Which brings us to the central paradox of the show's treatment of childhood resilience. The children of South Park are resilient. Remarkably so. They survive things that would destroy most adults. They bounce back from trauma after trauma. They maintain friendships, attend school, engage with the world. By any external measure, they're functioning. But resilience isn't the same as health. Resilience, in the context of childhood trauma, often means learning to suppress your own needs. Learning to function despite pain rather than addressing the pain. Learning to perform normalcy so convincingly that the adults around you never realize you need help. And that's exactly what the children of South Park do. They perform normalcy. They go to school. They play. They argue about trivial things. And underneath that performance, they carry the accumulated weight of everything the show has put them through. The show never explicitly acknowledges this weight. That's part of its design. The reset at the end of each episode is the fictional equivalent of suppression. Whatever happened this week gets filed away, unprocessed, and next week starts fresh. But just as suppressed trauma in real life doesn't disappear, just goes underground and expresses itself in other ways, the suppressed trauma of South Park's children leaks out in subtle ways throughout the series. Stan's depression, Kyle's anger, Kenny's recklessness, Cartman's, well, everything about Cartman. These aren't personality traits in a vacuum. They're symptoms, and the show knows they're symptoms. It just doesn't label them as such, because labeling them would break the comedy, and the comedy is the mechanism through which the truth gets delivered. And we laugh at it, because the show is funny, because Randy falling off a wagon is inherently comedic, because Stan's cynicism is relatable, and his drinking is played as a wry callback. But underneath the laughter, the mechanism is real. Children learn from their parents. They absorb patterns. They inherit coping strategies. And when those strategies are destructive, the inheritance is a kind of curse that looks, from the outside, like a choice. Before we move on from individual characters, there's one more figure who deserves attention in any discussion of South Park's darkness: Mr. Garrison, or Mrs. Garrison, or whatever iteration of the character we're discussing at any given point in the series. Mr. Garrison is perhaps the show's most psychologically complex character, and also its most troubling. He's a teacher, which means he's in a position of authority over children. And across the series, his behavior in that role ranges from merely incompetent to genuinely dangerous. He teaches material that's wildly inappropriate. He projects his own insecurities onto his students. He uses the classroom as a stage for his personal dramas. And the school system, represented by Principal Victoria and later PC Principal, either can't or won't remove him. But the deeper darkness of Mr. Garrison lies in what the show reveals about his inner life. Across various episodes, we learn that Garrison was molested as a child, though the show presents this through a characteristically twisted lens. We learn that he's struggled with his sexuality and his gender identity for decades. We learn that his father's failure to abuse him, in the disturbing logic of the show's universe, became its own source of trauma. A joke that's simultaneously one of the darkest and most psychologically astute observations the show has ever made. Because what the show is really saying with that storyline is something about how cycles of abuse warp a person's understanding of normalcy. Garrison grew up in a community where a certain kind of harm was so common that its absence became a source of anxiety. He interpreted his father's non-abuse not as a blessing, but as rejection. And that twisted interpretation, born from a culture that normalized harm, shaped every aspect of his adult life. Garrison's journey through the series, from closeted man to openly gay man to transgender woman and back again, has been criticized by some as mockery of the trans community. And there's a valid conversation to be had about whether the show handles that material well. But within the internal logic of the character, Garrison's shifting identity reads less as a joke about trans people and more as a portrait of someone who never received the psychological help they needed. Someone whose trauma was never addressed, whose community failed to support them, and who consequently spent decades searching for an identity that would make the pain stop. Sound familiar? That's the South Park pattern again. Unaddressed trauma-producing dysfunction that the community enables rather than treats. It plays out in every character, from Cartman to Kenny to Butters to Randy to Garrison. The specifics change, the mechanism doesn't. And the fact that Garrison eventually becomes president of the United States in the show, a clear parallel to real events, adds another layer of darkness. The show is suggesting that a system broken enough to produce someone like Garrison is also a system broken enough to elevate him to the highest possible position of authority. That dysfunction, given enough time and the right conditions, doesn't just persist. It rises to the top. There's also something worth exploring about the show's treatment of childhood itself. Because South Park makes a claim about childhood that most other media won't touch. The claim that childhood is not innocent. Not in the sense that children are guilty of anything, but in the sense that the myth of childhood innocence is itself a kind of violence. It's a story adults tell themselves to justify not talking to children about the real world. And the gap between what children actually experience and what adults pretend they experience is one of the primary sources of harm in the show. The children of South Park are exposed to everything: sex, drugs, violence, political extremism, religious hypocrisy, economic exploitation. And the adults around them pretend this exposure isn't happening. They put parental controls on the television while ignoring the real dangers in the community. They fret about video game violence while their own marriages fall apart in front of their children. They hold town meetings about perceived threats while actual threats go unaddressed. This disconnect between adult anxiety and actual risk is one of the show's most consistent themes. In Child Abduction Is Not Funny, Season 6, Episode 11, the town becomes hysteric about child kidnapping. Parents build walls, impose curfews, and eventually banish all children from the town entirely. The irony, which the show lays out with characteristic bluntness, is that the children were never in danger from strangers. The danger, as always, came from inside the community, from the parents' own anxiety, projection, and inability to address real problems. Tweek Tweek is another character who illustrates this perfectly. Tweek is visibly anxious, twitching, and paranoid, and for years the show played this as a character quirk. But the underlying cause is eventually made clear. His parents, who own a coffee shop, give him coffee constantly. They're literally drugging their child with a stimulant, creating the very anxiety they claim to be concerned about. And beyond the coffee, they feed his fears. They tell him about threats that don't exist. They create an environment of perpetual panic and then wonder why their child can't function. Tweek's parents aren't villains. They're not intentionally harming their son. They're just doing what the adults of South Park always do, creating dysfunction through a combination of ignorance, selfishness, and the inability to see their own behavior clearly. The harm is casual, unthinking, and that makes it worse, not better. Because intentional cruelty can be identified and addressed. Unintentional cruelty, the kind that comes from people who think they're doing the right thing, is much harder to name and much harder to stop. Let's talk for a moment about Chef, because his story represents one of the most unsettling intersections of South Park's fiction with real-world events. Chef, voiced by Isaac Hayes, was one of the few genuinely positive adult figures in the children's lives. He was warm, caring, and often provided the kind of guidance and emotional support that their parents failed to offer. He was, in many ways, the show's answer to its own thesis about broken adults, proof that at least one adult in South Park cared about the children enough to show up for them. And then the Scientology happened. After South Park aired Trapped in the Closet, a satirical take on Scientology in Season 9, Isaac Hayes, himself a Scientologist, left the show. There's been some dispute about the circumstances, with some reports suggesting Hayes was influenced by others in the Church of Scientology to quit, and his associates later claiming he'd had a stroke and the decision wasn't entirely his own. Regardless, Hayes departed, and the show responded with The Return of Chef in Season 10. In that episode, Chef returns to South Park brainwashed by a group called the Super Adventure Club, an obvious stand-in for Scientology. He's been reprogrammed to behave inappropriately toward children, and then he dies. Violently. Spectacularly. He's struck by lightning, catches fire, falls off a bridge, gets impaled on a tree, and is then mauled by a mountain lion and a grizzly bear. His body is torn apart. The death is so excessive, so gratuitous, that it feels less like a farewell and more like an execution. The show that gave the children their one reliable adult figure took him away in the most brutal way possible. And the meta-context, the real-world dispute between the show's creators and the Church of Scientology, bleeds into the fiction in a way that makes the whole thing deeply uncomfortable. Because what the episode is really about is the loss of a good person to an ideology. Chef didn't choose to become dangerous. He was taken, reprogrammed, and turned into something unrecognizable. And the children, who loved him, who relied on him, had to watch it happen without being able to stop it. Stan's final speech in the episode, where he says they shouldn't be angry at Chef, but at the fruity little club that scrambled his brains, is one of the show's most affecting moments. It's a child grappling with the loss of someone who mattered to them, and trying to understand that the person who hurt them and the person they loved are somehow the same person. That's not just a South Park storyline. That's the experience of anyone who's watched a loved one change, whether through radicalization, addiction, mental illness, or any of the countless forces that can take a good person and turn them into someone you don't recognize. And the show, characteristically, offers no resolution. Chef is gone. The children grieve briefly. And then the reset happens, and life continues without him. The loss of Chef removed the one functional safety net the children had. After his death, there's no adult in the show who consistently, reliably shows up for the kids. They're truly on their own. And the show never replaces him, never introduces another adult who fills that role. The message is clear. The safety net had a hole in it even before Chef left. Now, there's nothing. Now, I want to talk about something that connects all of these individual tragedies into a larger pattern. Something about the way the show itself functions as a piece of art. Because the most disturbing thing about South Park might not be any individual storyline. It might be the relationship between the show and its audience. The way it uses comedy to make us complicit in things we would never accept in any other context. Think about what you've done as a viewer of this show. You've laughed at a child being murdered hundreds of times. You've laughed at domestic abuse. You've laughed at addiction. You've laughed at a 9-year-old committing murder and feeding the victims to their son. You've laughed at conversion therapy and attempted filicide and systemic neglect. And the show didn't trick you into laughing. It's not like the darkness is hidden and you only discover it later. It's right there, in every scene, in every joke. The show tells you exactly what's happening. Cartman feeds a boy his parents, and the show tells you this is what's happening. Kenny dies in agony, and the show tells you this is what's happening. Butters gets sent to a camp where children kill themselves, and the show tells you this is what's happening. You laugh anyway, because the show gives you permission to laugh. Through its tone, its pacing, its animation style, its comedic framing, it creates a context in which these events register as humor rather than horror. And you accept that context because it feels good to laugh, and it feels bad to think about child abuse. This is the genius of South Park, and also its most disturbing quality. It functions as a mirror. Not a mirror that shows you the world, but a mirror that shows you yourself. It shows you how easily you can be led to laugh at suffering. How readily you'll accept a comedic frame as an excuse to disengage your empathy. How quickly the phrase, "it's just a cartoon," can shut down any uncomfortable recognition of what you're actually watching. Matt Stone once said that laughter breaks down your defenses. He was talking about the Book of Mormon, but the principle applies equally to South Park. The show uses laughter to get past the walls you've built. The walls that say, "I care about children." I wouldn't laugh at abuse. I would notice if something terrible was happening in my community. The show gets past those walls, and then it shows you something terrible, and you laugh, and in that moment, your defenses are down, and the truth gets in. The truth that you probably wouldn't notice, that you probably would look away, that the distance between you and the townspeople of South Park, the enabling, indifferent adults who let everything happen, is a lot smaller than you'd like to think. This is what Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been doing for over 25 years. Not just making jokes about current events, not just being edgy for the sake of edginess. They've been conducting a long, slow experiment in human psychology. They've been testing how much you can put in front of an audience, how much genuine darkness and real suffering, before the audience stops laughing and starts thinking. And the answer, so far, seems to be that there isn't a limit. That the comedy format is so powerful, so effective at disarming critical thought, that you can portray essentially anything: murder, abuse, addiction, trauma, systemic failure, and as long as the timing is right and the punchline lands, people will laugh. They'll share the clip. They'll call it genius. And they'll go back to their lives without ever sitting with what they just watched. That's not a criticism of the audience, by the way. Or at least, not only a criticism. It's a recognition of how powerful narrative framing is. How much the context in which information is presented determines how we process it. A documentary about a child being systematically abused would make you cry. A South Park episode about the same thing makes you laugh. The facts are identical. The framing is different. And the framing wins every time. There's a specific dynamic in the show that illustrates this perfectly, and it has to do with the way the children process the world around them. Because the kids in South Park are not typical cartoon children. They don't exist in a protected, sanitized version of reality. They're exposed to everything: violence, sexuality, death, addiction, political extremism, religious hypocrisy, every aspect of adult life that real children are supposedly shielded from. And they process it all in real time, with no guidance, no support, and no one to explain what they're experiencing. Think about what Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman have witnessed over 26 seasons. They've been present for wars. They've encountered serial killers. They've navigated cults, epidemics, alien invasions, and political upheavals. They've watched friends die. They've been manipulated by adults who should have protected them. They've been forced to confront moral and philosophical questions that most adults never meaningfully engage with. And each time the episode ends, the status quo resets, and they go back to being kids. No therapy, no processing, no lasting change. Just another Monday, another day at school, another round of whatever fresh horror South Park has planned for them. This is the show's darkest structural choice. Not any individual storyline, but the reset itself. Because the reset is what normalizes everything. It's what says this is fine. It's what teaches both the characters and the audience that you can endure anything as long as you don't dwell on it. Don't process it. Don't let it change you. Just move on. And isn't that exactly what we do in real life? When we encounter things that are too difficult to process, too painful to sit with, too complicated to understand, we reset. We move on. We treat each horror as an isolated incident and get back to our routines. We have developed, collectively, the same coping mechanism that the characters of South Park have. Or maybe South Park learned it from us. There's something else worth examining. The show's treatment of consequences, or rather, its deliberate avoidance of them. In most fiction, actions have consequences. Characters who do terrible things are eventually punished. Characters who suffer eventually find justice, or at least catharsis. There's a moral architecture that gives the audience permission to engage with dark material because they trust it's going somewhere. That the bad will be punished and the good will be rewarded. South Park rejects this entirely. Cartman faces consequences sometimes, in individual episodes, but there's no overarching arc of justice. He doesn't learn. He doesn't grow. He doesn't pay for the sum total of his actions. Butters doesn't get rescued. Kenny doesn't get release from his curse. Randy doesn't get sober. The town doesn't improve. And this isn't lazy writing. It's a philosophical position. The show is saying that the real world doesn't have moral architecture. Bad people aren't reliably punished. Victims aren't reliably saved. Systems don't self-correct. The comforting narratives we tell ourselves about karma and justice and eventual accountability are just that, narratives. Stories we invent to make the randomness of suffering bearable. South Park removes those narratives and shows you what's left. A world where a sociopath thrives because the systems around him weren't designed to stop him. Where a good person suffers because goodness isn't armor, it's a vulnerability. Where addiction perpetuates across generations because no one interrupts the pattern. Where children are left to fend for themselves because the adults are too broken, too selfish, or too distracted to do their jobs. That's not a cartoon. That's a diagnosis. Let's talk about one more aspect of this darkness. The way the show handles death itself. Not just Kenny's deaths, which we've already discussed, but death as a concept throughout the series. South Park has always treated death casually. Characters die frequently and often gruesomely. Chef, one of the show's most beloved characters, was killed off in a spectacularly violent fashion in Season 10's The Return of Chef, after Isaac Hayes, who voiced the character, left the show following the Scientology episode. The manner of Chef's death, being burned, impaled, mauled, and dismembered, was so extreme that it felt less like a character exit and more like a punishment. And the show has killed children on screen. Not just Kenny, whose deaths are framed as temporary, but other children who are simply gone. The show treats these deaths with the same casual tone it treats everything else. No eulogies, no lasting grief, no recognition that something irreversible has happened. There are moments where the show confronts death with genuine gravity, and those moments are all the more powerful for being so rare. When Kenny dies permanently in Season 5's Kenny Dies, the other characters actually grieve. Stan can't bring himself to visit Kenny in the hospital. Kyle tries to be strong and falls apart. Even Cartman, in a twist that's quintessentially South Park, appears to grieve, but is actually using Kenny's stem cells for a personal scheme. The contrast between Kyle's genuine grief and Cartman's performative grief is the episode's darkest observation, that in a world where death is everywhere, even mourning can be corrupted. But then Kenny comes back, because the show can't permanently kill its running gag, because the structure demands the reset. And so the grief, the real grief that the episode genuinely earned, is retroactively nullified. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Death is a revolving door, and the emotions it provoked were wasted on an impermanent event. That cycle of genuine emotion, followed by structural erasure, is one of the cruelest things the show does. Not to its characters, but to its audience. It teaches you that feeling things is pointless. That emotional investment in this world is a bad bet. That the appropriate response to everything, even death, is detachment. Because the show will take whatever you feel and undo it by next week. This casual relationship with death serves the comedy, obviously. You can't make death jokes if death is treated with gravity. But it also serves the show's larger project of showing you what desensitization looks like. By the 5th or 6th time you watch Kenny get crushed by a falling object, you're not shocked anymore. You might smirk. You might not even register it. And that numbness, that acceptance of violence as background noise, is exactly what the show is documenting in its characters. The people of South Park have seen so much horror that they've stopped reacting to it. And by the 5th or 6th season, so have you. That parallel between the viewer's desensitization and the character's desensitization is one of the most sophisticated things about the show. It's not just depicting a phenomenon. It's reproducing the phenomenon in the audience. You're not watching a story about people who've become numb to suffering. You're becoming numb to suffering in real time through the act of watching. And once you notice that, once you become aware of the mechanism, it becomes very difficult to watch the show the same way. Every laugh feels a little more complicated. Every death scene carries a little more weight. Every instance of Butters being hurt, or Kenny being killed, or the adults failing the children becomes an invitation to ask yourself, am I still laughing? And if I am, what does that say about me? This is the disturbing truth that hides behind South Park. Not that the show is dark. Everyone knows it's dark. The disturbing truth is that the darkness isn't decoration. It's not there to be edgy or to push boundaries or to generate controversy. It's there because it's true. Because the things South Park depicts, The neglect and the abuse and the addiction and the systemic failure and the casual cruelty are real things that happen in real communities to real people. And the way we respond to them in the show, with laughter and indifference and a quick return to normal, is the way we respond to them in life. The show isn't just a mirror of society, it's a mirror of the viewer. And the image it reflects, if you're willing to look at it honestly, is not entirely flattering. There's a particularly telling dynamic in how the show handles moments of genuine emotion. Every now and then, South Park drops the comedy entirely and plays a scene straight. Stan's depression in You're Getting Old, Butter's speech to the conversion therapy counselors, Kenny's frustration at being forgotten. These moments are brief, usually lasting no more than a minute or two, but they hit with disproportionate force precisely because the show has spent so much time training you not to take anything seriously. When the comedy stops, even for a moment, the accumulated weight of everything you've been laughing at crashes down. You feel, briefly, the full emotional impact of what these characters have been going through. And then the comedy starts again, and you're pulled back into the safe space of humor, and the moment passes. But it doesn't fully pass. Those moments linger. They plant seeds. They make you wonder, during the next funny scene, whether the comedy is protecting you from something you should be feeling. And that wondering, that slight crack in the comedic armor, is where the show does its real work. Because South Park's ultimate project isn't to make you laugh. It isn't to shock you. It isn't even to make you think, exactly, although it does all of those things. Its ultimate project is to make you feel something you're designed to avoid feeling. To breach the defenses that protect you from empathy. To make you sit, even for a moment, with the reality of suffering that you'd prefer to file under someone else's problem. And it uses laughter to do it. Not despite the laughter, but through the laughter. Because laughter, as Stone said, breaks down your defenses. It gets you to open up. And once you're open, once the walls are down, the truth can get in. The truth about Cartman, about Kenny, about Butters, about Randy, about the town, about you. That's the darkness hiding behind South Park. Not the blood, and the profanity, and the dead children, and the sociopathic schemes. Those are just the surface. The real darkness is the recognition that we, the audience, are part of the system. That our laughter enables the same indifference that the show satirizes. That the distance between watching a cartoon and watching the world is shorter than we'd like to admit. And tomorrow, when the episode ends and the credits roll, we'll all do exactly what the people of South Park do. We'll shrug. We'll move on. We'll say it's just a show. And we'll go back to our lives without changing anything. Because that's the pattern. And the pattern holds. There's something deeply philosophical about the way Cartman functions within the social ecosystem of the show. Something that goes beyond just calling him a sociopath and moving on. Because the truly unsettling thing about Cartman isn't what he does. It's that the people around him allow it. Consider the fundamental question. Why is Cartman still part of the group? Stan doesn't like him. Kyle actively hates him much of the time. Kenny is largely indifferent to him. No one in the group genuinely enjoys Cartman's company. He contributes nothing positive. He's manipulative, cruel, bigoted, and dangerous. And yet, episode after episode, season after season, he's there. At the bus stop, in the cafeteria, part of the group. The show has occasionally addressed this directly, and the answers are never satisfying, because they're not meant to be. Cartman is there because he's always been there. Because removing him would require a confrontation no one wants to have. Because the path of least resistance is to keep things as they are, even when as they are involves regular exposure to a person who has committed murder. This is exactly how toxic dynamics persist in real life. In families, in workplaces, in friend groups, in communities. The destructive person stays because removing them is harder than accommodating them. because everyone else adjusts their behavior to manage the threat rather than eliminate it. Because at some point, the dysfunction becomes part of the identity of the group, and removing it would require everyone to reckon with how long they let it continue. Kyle occasionally tries. Kyle confronts Cartman, argues with him, calls him out. But Kyle's confrontations always fail. Not because Cartman is too powerful, but because the system isn't set up to support change. The other characters don't back Kyle up consistently. The adults don't intervene. The institutions don't respond. And Kyle, exhausted by fighting alone, eventually gives up and accepts the status quo until the next outrage. This is the cycle of every community that enables its own destruction. Someone notices the problem. Someone speaks up. The system absorbs the complaint without changing. The person who spoke up gets tired. The problem continues. And everyone else tells themselves, well, someone tried, and that's enough. And here's the most insidious part. The system doesn't just fail to respond to Kyle's complaints. It actively punishes him for making them. When Kyle challenges Cartman, Kyle is the one who gets drawn into conflict. He's the one who loses sleep, who gets stressed, who expends emotional energy. Cartman, meanwhile, is energized by the conflict. He thrives on it. The dynamic is perfectly designed to exhaust the person who cares and empower the person who doesn't. This is why Kyle's anger is so important to the show. It's not just a character trait. It's a natural response to systemic injustice. Kyle is angry because he can see what's happening and he can't stop it. He's angry because the adults who should be handling these problems have abdicated their responsibility. He's angry because his best friend is sliding into depression. His other friend keeps dying. His enemy keeps getting away with atrocities, and nobody seems to think any of this is abnormal. Kyle's anger is the anger of every person who has ever lived in a broken system and been told the system is working fine. It's the anger of the whistleblower, the activist, the child who sees their family falling apart and screams for someone to do something. And like those real-world counterparts, Kyle's anger doesn't fix anything. It just makes him tired. And tired is what the system needs him to be. Because tired people stop fighting. The show understands this dynamic with uncomfortable precision. It shows Kyle fighting the same battles year after year, making the same arguments, experiencing the same frustrations, and never achieving lasting change. And it shows us that this isn't because Kyle is doing something wrong. It's because the system is functioning exactly as designed. It absorbs dissent. It wears down resistance. It maintains itself. And if that sounds bleak, that's because it is. But it's also honest. And honesty, even bleak honesty, is worth something. Especially when it's delivered in a format that doesn't let you look away. It isn't enough. The show knows it isn't enough. But the show also knows that this is what actually happens, over and over, in real communities, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. There's a specific loneliness to Kyle's position that deserves attention. Because Kyle functions as the show's moral center, or at least its closest approximation of one. And being the moral center of South Park is an exhausting, thankless job. Kyle is the character who most often identifies when something is wrong, who argues for the right thing, who tries to hold the group and the town to some kind of ethical standard, and he fails, constantly. Not because he's wrong, he's usually right, but because being right doesn't matter when the structures around you are designed to maintain the status quo. Kyle is right about Cartman being dangerous. He's right about the adults being negligent. He's right about the town's priorities being warped. And none of it matters, because being right isn't the same as having power, and Kyle has no power. He's a child in a world run by broken adults, and his moral clarity is, functionally, irrelevant. That's one of the bleakest statements the show makes, that seeing clearly isn't enough, that knowing what's right isn't enough, that in a system designed to protect itself from change, The person who sees the truth most clearly is also the person most likely to be ground down by the impossibility of making anyone listen. Let's also consider what the show does with happiness, or rather, the absence of it. Can you think of a genuinely happy character in South Park? Not a character who's cheerful, like Butters, because Butters' cheerfulness is a survival mechanism, not a reflection of well-being. Not a character who's temporarily satisfied, like Randy in the first flush of his latest obsession. A character who is, in a deep and sustained way, happy. You probably can't, because the show doesn't have one. And that's a choice. In a show with hundreds of characters across 26 seasons, not a single person has achieved lasting contentment. Everyone is driven by something: anxiety, ambition, addiction, anger, fear, and that something never resolves. There's no peace in South Park. There's no character who's figured it out. There's only the cycle. The endless repetition of the same patterns, the same failures, the same destructive loops. This isn't nihilism exactly, although it borders on it. It's more like a very honest assessment of the human condition as the show's creators see it. People don't change. Systems don't change. The forces that produce suffering are self-perpetuating. And the best anyone can hope for is to recognize the pattern, even if recognizing it doesn't grant you the power to break it. That's dark. That's genuinely, philosophically dark. Darker than any individual plot point or character action. Because it's not saying bad things happen. It's saying bad things happen, and they'll keep happening. And the mechanisms that produce them are so deeply embedded in human nature and social structure that addressing them may be beyond our collective capacity. And then it makes a fart joke, and you laugh, and the pattern holds. There's a philosophical tradition behind this, and South Park sits within it, whether its creators intended that or not. Existentialism, the philosophical movement most associated with thinkers like Camus and Sartre, is fundamentally concerned with the question of how to live in a universe that offers no inherent meaning. And South Park, for all its crudeness, engages with that question more seriously than most prestige dramas. The town of South Park is an absurd universe. Events happen without logic, without justice, without any narrative force pushing toward resolution. Good people suffer, bad people prosper. Lessons learned in one episode are forgotten by the next. The universe of the show is, in the most literal sense, indifferent to the suffering of its inhabitants. And the character's response to that indifference mirrors the existentialist responses Camus identified. Some, like Stan in his depressive phase, experience the nausea of recognition, the moment where the meaninglessness of everything becomes impossible to ignore. Some, like Randy, pursue distraction after distraction, using activity to avoid confronting the void. Some, like Kyle, attempt to impose meaning through moral conviction, creating their own values in a valueless world. And some, like Cartman, abandon the project of meaning entirely and pursue pure self-interest, becoming Nietzsche's worst-case scenario made flesh. None of these responses work. That's the show's quiet philosophical claim. There is no correct response to a universe that doesn't care about you. You can rage against it, distract yourself from it, try to impose order on it, or exploit it for personal gain. None of these strategies produce lasting satisfaction. None of them fix the fundamental problem. And the show cycles through all of them, across all of its characters, across all of its seasons, without ever landing on an answer. This isn't nihilism, even though it sounds like it. Nihilism says nothing matters and stops there. South Park says nothing matters and then asks, so what do you do? And the answer it arrives at, implicitly, through the accumulated weight of hundreds of episodes, is that you keep going. Not because going produces meaning, but because going is what there is. You wake up. You go to school. You deal with whatever absurdity the universe throws at you today. You survive. and you do it again tomorrow. Not because survival is glorious, or noble, or proof of anything in particular, just because it's what you do. Kenny embodies this more than any other character. He dies, and he wakes up, and he goes to school. He doesn't have a grand philosophy about it. He doesn't make speeches about perseverance. He just keeps showing up. And there's something in that, something that the show doesn't overstate, but doesn't ignore either. The act of continuing in the face of meaninglessness might be the closest thing to meaning that a meaningless universe can offer. Camus wrote about Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time. And Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because the task is fulfilling, but because the act of engaging with it, of pushing the boulder despite knowing it will fall, is itself a kind of defiance. A refusal to let the absurdity of the situation dictate your response to it. Kenny is Sisyphus. He dies, and the boulder rolls back down. He wakes up, and he starts pushing again. And the show, in its strange and often crude way, asks us to imagine Kenny happy. Or at least, to imagine Kenny continuing, which might be the same thing. There's a counter-argument to all of this, of course. The counter-argument says that South Park is just a cartoon, that reading this much depth into a show that features talking Christmas poo and a character called Mr. Hanky is an exercise in overthinking, that Stone and Parker are comedians, not philosophers, and the darkness in the show is just the natural byproduct of pushing boundaries for shock value. And maybe there's some truth to that. Not every dark moment in South Park is calculated. Not every disturbing storyline is a deliberate commentary on the human condition. Some of it is just two guys in a writer's room asking what's the most messed up thing we can do this week and going from there. But intention isn't the only thing that matters in art. Meaning can emerge from patterns that the artist didn't fully intend. And the patterns in South Park are too consistent, too persistent, and too psychologically precise to be entirely accidental. You don't accidentally create a 26-season arc about a child living in systematic abuse without something intentional at work. You don't accidentally build a show around the theme of institutional failure unless institutional failure is something you're thinking about. You don't accidentally make your audience complicit in the very indifference you're satirizing unless you understand, on some level, how complicity works. Stone and Parker may not sit in the writer's room and say, let us now explore the existential implications of Kenny's immortality. They probably just say, what if Kenny's deaths are real, and nobody remembers, and then work outward from there. But the fact that working outward from there consistently produces something philosophically rich says something about the intuitions that guide their storytelling. They may not be consciously doing philosophy, but they're doing it nonetheless. And the show is richer for it. I want to return, one more time, to Kenny. Because there's a dimension of his story that we haven't fully explored, and it has to do with the nature of witnessing. Kenny dies, and no one remembers. We've established that. But there is one witness to Kenny's deaths who never forgets. You, the viewer. You see every death. You remember them, at least vaguely. You carry the cumulative weight of Kenny's suffering in a way that no character in the show does. This makes you, the viewer, the closest thing Kenny has to a real witness. The only consciousness in the entire South Park universe that holds the full record of what he's been through. And you use that record, you use your unique knowledge of Kenny's suffering to laugh. The show has created a dynamic where the audience occupies the same position as Kenny's absent friends, but without the excuse of supernatural amnesia. You remember. You know what's happening. You see the pattern, and you choose to laugh anyway. Not because you're a bad person, but because the show has made it easy. It's given you permission. It's structured the experience so that laughter is the path of least resistance. But Kenny has no such comfort. Kenny, within the fiction, dies in real pain and wakes up in a world that doesn't care. And the viewer, outside the fiction, watches in real knowledge and responds with a world that doesn't care. The parallel is almost too neat, too perfectly constructed to be accidental. The show hasn't just created a character who suffers unwitnessed. It's created an audience that witnesses suffering and treats it as entertainment. And the gap between those two things, between seeing and caring, between knowing and acting, is exactly the gap that makes the real world as broken as the fictional one. There's a thread running through the show that we haven't fully explored yet, and it has to do with the way South Park depicts childhood friendships. Because the relationships between Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman are not, by any reasonable standard, healthy friendships. They're survival bonds. They're the relationships you form not because you chose each other, but because you were thrown together by geography and circumstance, and you've been through too much to separate now. Think about what binds these four boys together. It's not shared interests, really. It's not mutual admiration. It's not the things that typically form the basis of childhood friendship. It's shared trauma. They've survived things together that no one else would believe. They've seen each other at their worst. They've been complicit in each other's worst moments. And that shared history, that accumulated weight of experience, creates a bond that functions less like friendship and more like a hostage situation. They can't leave because no one outside the group would understand what they've been through. This is especially true for Kyle and Stan, whose friendship is the closest thing the show has to a genuine emotional core. Kyle and Stan care about each other. That's real. But their friendship exists within a context so toxic that even their genuine connection gets warped by it. Stan's depression pushes Kyle away. Kyle's moral rigidity frustrates Stan, and both of them are constantly pulled toward Cartman's orbit, spending energy managing his behavior that could be directed toward actually supporting each other. The show occasionally acknowledges this directly. There are episodes where Stan and Kyle fight, where their friendship seems to be crumbling, and the resolution is never that they fix the underlying problems. It's that they decide the friendship is worth preserving despite the problems. Which sounds heartwarming until you realize that the problems include regular exposure to a sociopath, a town that provides no support, and families that are, in their different ways, failing them. They're not choosing each other. They're choosing the least bad option. And the show, to its credit, never pretends otherwise. There's also the question of what happens to these children in the long term. South Park exists in a kind of eternal present where the characters never age, where seasons change, but the boys remain in 4th grade forever. But if you project forward, if you imagine what these children would become as adults based on what they've experienced, the picture is grim. Stan, with his family history of addiction and his own early experiences with depression and alcohol, is statistically likely to develop substance abuse issues. Kyle, with his chronic frustration and his role as the unheard moral voice, is at risk for burnout, anxiety, and the kind of deep cynicism that comes from caring too much in a world that doesn't reward caring. Kenny, with his poverty, his trauma, and his complete lack of psychological support, faces outcomes that mirror those of real children in similar circumstances: limited education, limited opportunity, and the perpetuation of the same cycles that trapped his parents. And Cartman? Well, Cartman with power is something the show has explored in multiple episodes, and it never ends well for anyone. The show doesn't explore these futures, because doing so would break the eternal present that allows it to function. But the implication is always there, hovering just below the surface. These children are being shaped by their experiences. The lack of consequences within the show doesn't mean there wouldn't be consequences in a more realistic framework. It means the show is choosing not to show you the long-term damage, because showing you would require abandoning the comedy. And the comedy is what keeps you watching. It's another layer of the same trick. The show protects you from the full implications of what you're seeing, not through deception, but through structure. By never aging the characters, by resetting the status quo, by maintaining the comedy framework, The show ensures that you never have to confront the cumulative impact of what these children have endured. You can watch 26 seasons of abuse, trauma, and dysfunction and walk away thinking it was just a funny show, because the structure tells you it was just a funny show, even though the content tells you something entirely different. Let's also consider how the show treats the concept of home, because for most of the characters in South Park, home is not a place of safety. It's a place of threat. Kenny's home is physically dangerous, economically precarious, and emotionally empty. Butter's home is the primary site of his abuse. Stan's home is defined by his father's dysfunction and his parents' failing marriage. Cartman's home is a permissive vacuum where no one sets limits or provides guidance. The school isn't much better. The teachers are unstable. The administration is either authoritarian or absurd. The curriculum is irrelevant. The social dynamics are brutal. There is no space in these children's world that functions as a genuine sanctuary. No place they can go to be safe, to be heard, to be helped. This is not incidental. This is the show's fundamental worldview. There is no safe space. There is no authority you can trust. There is no institution that will protect you. You are alone, and the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can begin the work of surviving without illusions. It's a harsh worldview. It's also, for many people, an accurate one. And the fact that South Park delivers this worldview through crude animation and fart jokes doesn't make it less true. It might make it more true, because the delivery mechanism ensures that the message reaches people who would reject it in any other format. You wouldn't sit through a 2-hour documentary about institutional failure and the myth of childhood safety, but you'll watch 26 seasons of South Park, and the message gets in. Slowly, incrementally, one dark joke at a time. There's one last thing I want to sit with before we start to wind down, and it's about the nature of comedy itself as it functions in South Park. Comedy, at its most basic, is a release mechanism. It takes tension and discharges it harmlessly. You're anxious about something. Someone makes a joke about it. The anxiety converts to laughter, and you feel better. It's therapeutic. It's healthy. It's one of humanity's oldest and most effective coping strategies. But South Park does something slightly different with comedy. It doesn't discharge tension. It redirects it. The tension of watching a child get abused doesn't go away when you laugh at the scene. It gets rerouted. It gets filed under humor instead of horror. It gets stored in a different part of your emotional architecture. But it's still there. It's still accumulating. And over the course of 26 seasons, the accumulation is massive. Every dark joke, every casual death, every instance of abuse and neglect and cruelty gets filed away in the comedy cabinet of your mind. You don't feel the weight of it because it's labeled funny. But if you were to take every dark moment in the show and re-experience it without the comedic framing, the emotional impact would be overwhelming. That's what this video is doing, in a way. It's asking you to open the comedy cabinet and look at what's inside. Not to make you feel bad for laughing, but to make you aware of what you've been laughing at. Because awareness matters. It's the first step toward the kind of critical engagement that the show, underneath all the jokes, is actually asking for. Matt Stone and Trey Parker are not nihilists. They don't make South Park because they think nothing matters. They make it because they think everything matters. So much that the only way to talk about it honestly is through humor. Because humor is the only language that can hold contradictions. That can say this is terrible and this is funny at the same time. That can make you feel empathy and amusement simultaneously, and let you figure out for yourself what to do with those competing impulses. The show trusts its audience. It trusts you to eventually see through the comedy to the truth underneath. It trusts you to recognize the darkness not as decoration, but as diagnosis. It trusts you to sit with the discomfort of laughing at things that aren't, in any objective sense, funny. And maybe that trust is the most disturbing thing of all. Because it implies that Stone and Parker believe we're capable of better. That we can laugh and think at the same time. That we can enjoy a comedy and still recognize when it's showing us something real. That the laughter doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. It can be the beginning. And maybe that's the final disturbing truth. Not that South Park is dark. Not that we laugh at darkness. But that the darkness is real. And the laughter is real. And they can coexist in the same moment without canceling each other out. That you can genuinely find something funny and genuinely recognize that it describes something terrible. And both of those responses are valid, and neither one erases the other. The show has been doing this for more than a quarter of a century now. 26 seasons, over 300 episodes, thousands of deaths, hundreds of controversies, countless moments of brilliance buried inside moments of crudity. And through all of it, the same fundamental project. Show people the world as it is. Make them laugh so they'll keep looking. And trust that eventually, the looking will change something. Whether it has changed anything is an open question. The world doesn't seem notably less broken than it was when South Park premiered in 1997. The patterns the show identifies, the addiction and the neglect, and the institutional failure and the casual cruelty are all still firmly in place. Maybe nothing changed because the show is just a show, and art doesn't have that kind of power. Or maybe the change is slower than we can measure. Maybe it happens one viewer at a time, in moments too quiet to track. A person watches the Mysterion arc and thinks about Kenny differently. Someone sees Butters at the conversion camp and feels something they can't name. A parent watches Randy and recognizes something uncomfortable about their own behavior. Those moments don't make headlines. They don't generate metrics. But they're real. And they accumulate. And over 26 seasons, the accumulation might add up to something. Not a revolution. Not a fix. Just a slightly wider crack in the armor that protects us from seeing what's in front of us. South Park didn't create the darkness it portrays. It just refused to look away from it. And in its strange, crude, brilliant, offensive, compassionate way, it asked us to stop looking away too. Most of us haven't managed it yet. But the show's still going, and the invitation is still open. So that's the disturbing truth hiding behind South Park. Not a single revelation, not one dark episode, or one twisted character. It's the whole thing. The entire architecture of the show is built on a foundation of genuine human darkness, real patterns of abuse, addiction, neglect, and institutional failure. And it's covered with a layer of comedy so effective that most viewers never dig beneath it. But the darkness is there. It's always been there. In Cartman's escalation from bully to murderer. In Kenny's silent, unwitnessed suffering. In Butters' systematic victimization by everyone who should love him. In Randy's unbroken cycle of addiction. In Stan's inherited despair. In the town's collective refusal to confront its own dysfunction. In the audience's willingness to laugh at all of it. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the laughter serves a purpose. Maybe it's the only way we can look at these things without being destroyed by them. Maybe South Park's greatest gift is that it lets us confront the darkness through a medium that protects us from it, at least enough to keep watching. But every now and then, the comedy stops for just a moment. And in that silence, you can hear the truth. It's quiet, it's uncomfortable, and it's real. Thanks for listening tonight. I hope you found something in this to think about, or something to drift off to, or maybe a little of both. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.